Good morning. Welcome to the session on new windows into consciousness. My name is Mavi SANCHEZ-VIVES, and I will be the chair of this session. And the understanding of consciousness has a long history in humanity in different disciplines, such as philosophy or psychology, physiology. But in the field of neuroscience, it has gained as a topic on its own significant attention since the 1990s. Can I have the slides, please? Yes, so there are different reasons why we are interested in the study of consciousness. So on the one hand, we are interested in brain mechanisms underlying consciousness, also even in modeling some of these mechanisms. There are also clinical disorders of consciousness, so therefore there are clinical implications for these studies because we want to understand the mechanisms of these disorders. We want to be able to diagnose, to capture in the brain activity what is the consciousness level. We want also to devise eventually treatments that are able to get the brain to induce transitions, to be able to maybe wake up people with disorders of consciousness. We also want to understand altered states of consciousness, such as those in drugs, in anesthesia, what are the anesthesia levels, how it reflects in the activity patterns, in the brain dynamics, and so on. Also, it is relevant in the field of brain-machine interfaces in sensory replacement. So, for example, in order to devise, as it's done in the Human Brain Project, visual prosthesis, it's important to understand what is the threshold for a stimuli to reach awareness. So it's also important in that sense. Of course, it's also important in philosophy and ethics, and there has been work on this also in the Human Brain Project. There is another field, which is consciousness in machines, in robots, in artificial intelligence. And of course, as scientists and as humans, also we have the need to know. We need to understand nature, and we need to understand ourselves, and consciousness is a topic that brings these together. So therefore, there are many reasons to investigate consciousness. And of course, we won't cover all of them in this session today, but this is what we are going to be hearing about. I will make a short introduction on consciousness studies in the HBP, and then we have 3 speakers that will cover different areas. This is work done in HBP or very, very closely related to HBP in the case of the second speaker. And they are also speakers in different stages in their careers, more senior, more junior. And we are going to hear about loss and recovery of consciousness, measures and mechanisms by Marcello MASSIMINI from the University of Milan in Italy. The second talk will be At the Frontiers of Mental State Reportability by Athina DEMERTZI from the University of Liège in Belgium. And the third talk will be Why Robots Are Not Conscious, a synthetic view of body perception and awareness by Pablo LANILLOS from the CSIC in Spain and Donders in the Netherlands. So I will make this very brief introduction about what has been done in the Human Brain Project in the area of consciousness, and this has been done mostly in a work package with the name Networks Underlying Cognition and Consciousness. The fields studied in this area has been, or in this work package particularly, has been, on the one hand, the study of brain states, many different aspects of brain states, such as how do we identify them, what are the brain dynamics, how is the modeling of different brain states, what are the multiscale mechanisms of these different brain states, how are the transitions also across these brain states, or how does the brain respond in different ones, or the clinical measures of brain states, between other things. Another large block here has been the study of cognition, such as object recognition or decision-making. Also, this has a connection with AI and robotics, cognitive architectures, models of multisensory processing and neuromodulation of cognition. Of course, there are many groups involved, and therefore there are many different areas covered. And in the center of this, and in the intersection, actually, of these areas, there has been an investigation in consciousness in some of the areas that I mentioned before. Also, there has been a special dedication to the ethical and philosophical framework for the experimental and computational explorations of cognition and consciousness. So, as you will hear about in the next talks, there has been research on consciousness levels, quantification, modeling, on consciousness content also. I mentioned about the visual prosthesis, the perceptual awareness, what is the state of the brain in order for a stimuli to be perceived, and then also in what we can call applications, which is closer to the clinical, brain-computer interfaces, and so on, theories of consciousness, and ethics of consciousness. So I have only a couple of minutes to tell you a bit about an aspect that I don't think is going to be covered in the next 3 talks. And we have made an effort to do a multi-scale investigation of the different problems we have studied. In the case of the multi-scale investigation of brain studies, our attempt, given that there is a very highly collaborative project, we have tried to approach the same problems with many different angles and different scales. So, for example, in the case of the study of a brain complexity evoked by brain stimulation, which can be used as one of the measures of consciousness levels, we have studied this in full brain, in patients, but also in very simple preparations all the way down to cortical slices and to models. And of course, all these different levels provide different details on the understanding. Some of them can only be understood in models or in very simple systems, or of course, we need also the human component. So we have tried to do as it's shown here. Of course, I'm not going to explain the details, but Marcello MASSIMINI will be talking about one of these measures of perturbation of the brain and to study how is the complexity evoked in the response. So we have measured this, for example, in very simple systems, as I said, such as cortical slices, that of course they give us a view of the local circuits, and we have been able to measure how is the role, what is the role of GABA A, of GABA B inhibition, how different levels of inhibition have an impact on the complexity evoked, and therefore how can they be related to these global different levels of consciousness. So this is an example of this multi-scale investigation. And to finish, I will give you another example, but now in the field of cognition. So on the multi-scale mechanisms of perceptual awareness, I will illustrate just with one of the studies. So there is an issue which is to be able to detect, to separate a figure from the ground. And this is something that has been studied also at different levels in humans, as you can see here, in monkeys, in mouse, trying to identify how is the response of the brain when a stimulus is provided, and it's known that it's not only enough the early activation of the primary visual cortex in order to do this processing. So it's known that the late responses evoked by the visual stimulus reflect activity also from other areas, higher processing, and this is related with the perception of the stimulus. So by one of the groups, it has been found that these late responses in the mouse can be controlled with optogenetics activating different populations or inactivating different populations of neurons, such that the late responses are controlled, and so are the identification of this figure background separation. So with these two examples, I finish. I just wanted to tell you about these aspects that I don't think they will be mentioned in the next talks, but they reflect the multi-scale approach that we have attempted in the study of consciousness. So next, I will invite the next speaker, Marcello MASSIMINI. Please come to the stage. And he will talk about multi-scale study of disorders of consciousness and quantification.
Thank you, Mavi, and thank you all for being here at this first session. I'm very grateful for this invitation, and I'm especially grateful for being part of this project. Really, it is a journey with colleagues and friends. And in my presentation, I'm going to present some snapshot of this journey that we took all together around consciousness. And so if I can have my first slide. Not really. No, this is, I can try, Athina, if you want, but no, it's MASSIMINI. Yeah. All right, thank you. And so this is just to say that, yes, it's teamwork, and I cannot present it all, of course, so I will take particular angle and just a few snapshots. I want to start from a very simple slide that I actually removed because I've shown it too many times, but then I said, no, I think it's important and it's timely. And this slide shows that, the way we measure consciousness normally, the approach we take traditionally is to judge consciousness by function, by the complexity of behavior. And we do this assuming that there is some relationship, more or less linear. We do this in intensive care, acute rehabilitation, when we probe patients to show behavior with commands and we observe responses. We do this if we are called to infer consciousness in the animal kingdom. So we say that the dog is more conscious than a jellyfish, maybe, because it shows a behavior that is more complex, similar to ours. And it works in general, but the world is changing. And so, on one hand, we are saving brains that are different. 50 years ago, this brain didn't exist, didn't survive, and sometimes these are brain islands that are disconnected from input and output. I'll talk more about this. But on the x-axis of function, behavior, they're very poor. And on the other hand, and that's why I wanted to put back this slide, we have this powerful machine. So this is, Watson many years ago, and then AlphaGo, and then now ChatGPT or Lion. This is, the Google engineer saying, my chatbot is conscious, then he was fired. But actually, a few years later, ChatGPT is here, and things are going fast on this x-axis. And the risk is not so much for us, but for future generation, my kids, sometimes I think about them, to be confused. That is, if we keep measuring consciousness on this axis, we might see consciousness when there is none and miss it when it's present. So false positive and false negative. So we need a better radar. And especially this is urgent for patients. So in patients, as I said, we treat the brain as a black box and work on input-output relationship using these scales. So we move your hand, open your eyes, this and that. And this is the way we assess consciousness, and we stratify patients, VS, vegetative state, presumably unconscious, and then if there is some purposeful movement, minimally conscious minus, if there is a little bit of command following, plus, and then emergence from the minimally conscious state. So we use this method, working on, again, the axis of behavior. And when it works, but sometimes it can fail. For example, the patient might be paralyzed. He understands commands, cannot respond, or even disconnected on the input side. And indeed, sometimes, this is not a philosophical exercise, after the intensive care medicine, we are facing these brain islands, large, metabolically active, possibly disconnected, largely disconnected from input and outputs because of frontal lesions that are impairing executive functions, because of language network impairment, so they don't understand, because lesions of the brainstem. There are so many cases you can be conscious but disconnected. And this potential for islands of awareness within the brain is difficult to judge by the extrinsic perspective of input and output. So that's why we need to develop measures that are brain-based, independent of sensory input and motor output, which somehow, it's something close to detecting the neural correlates of consciousness. And we know that the theoretical debate is still open here. There are actually programs in place to advocate between different theories, such as the Templeton Foundation. But I want to take a much simpler, general, practical approach, going back to this paper, for example, many years ago, more than 20 years ago. This is the first paper linking consciousness to a specific kind of complexity, so the coexistence of integration, coalitions of neurons, and differentiation, repertoires of state. It's interesting for two reasons, I think, this paper. It's very general. I think we all agree, more or less, that this is an important factor. It's related to the phenomenology of consciousness, the unity and the richness of consciousness, and it's tractable in empirical terms. And indeed, if you go and look at the literature, you see that there are lots of papers that are actually using this kind of measure of complexity that tries to capture and strike a balance between integration and differentiation. So at the time, 2 years ago, when we reviewed this, there were at least 200 or more papers, but literature is growing fast, like 3-4 papers per month. And there are many different approaches. So this is a paper by Lupi and Stamatakis using fMRI in anesthesia. This is a beautiful paper by one of the speakers here, Athina DEMERTZI, who used this kind of metrics of integration and differentiation in coma patients, again using fMRI. And there are many different ways. I mean, EEG, stereo EEG, TMS-EEG, many techniques, and across different conditions, and they all sort of converging. They converge in this good relationship between correlation between the present consciousness and the level of complexity. It's interesting because this is purely, I mean, most of these works are theoretical. They start from different frameworks. But as a matter of fact, there is this empirical conversion. And I think it's important to point it out because we are always very, we always sort of say, we don't know about consciousness, the theories and this and that. But as a matter of fact, as a community, as an empirical community, we are making little steps in spite of all these debates. And yeah, of course, I mean, there are many different ways of measuring complexity. There should be a taxonomy here. So you can derive networks from activity and then compute the complexity of the network with graph theory. You can compute complexity directly from time series. You can also perturb the brain to engage interactions, a chain of causal interactions, that is integration, and then zip this activity pattern to measure the differentiation of the pattern. And I will talk a little bit more about this because I know this better, because it takes the problem of integration seriously by the causal perspective of perturbation, and because there was some effort, as Mavi said, in this project to understand at the multiscale level these kind of measures. And the rationale for this measure and the way we apply this in humans is the following. It's quite simple. So there is a perturbation of the cortex direct with TMS. Then we record the chain of interaction through EEG activity. So this is evoked deterministic responses. And then we zip to compute the information content. And the more you can zip it, the less complex this pattern is. And the assumption, actually what is expected to capture the measure is that if there is no integration, the response is going to be local in space and time, so easy to compress. If the system loses differentiation, the response is going to be redundant, easy to compress, and only if it's integrated and differentiated, you will have a hard time compressing. So this number will be high. And it's interesting to note that this approach has some interesting features. So first of all, by perturbing and recording, you use a typical neurophysiological technique to study the input-output properties of neurons. This is relevant for mechanism. It's causal in nature, so you are only extracting and computing the complexity of whatever is deterministic and causal. It bypasses sensory input, motor output. It does not require the subject to be engaged in any task. So it's good for patients. And the way this works is, it's a difficult technique. We are, over the years, trying to make it easier in view of clinical applications. So this is the latest prototype we developed together with Nextim, a Finnish company. You have a navigation system where you point your stimulator, so you know how strong and where you're stimulating. And then, this is crucial, you have a feedback of the echo of the electrical response of the brain on the spot. It's like echography. You see it there, and you see the response changing, so you can titrate your stimulation, but also you can see the response changing on the spot, on the screen. So basically, to give an example, when a subject is awake, you see this kind of response here, typically on the screen, and when the subject is fully anesthetized or asleep, the change is major. You see it. You don't need to do statistics. Of course, then you need to quantify all this. And the way we quantify this is by compressing these patterns. And the first step we took was to calibrate this in some, more known condition before applying the radar to the unknown. And these conditions included conditions where the subjects were conscious, because they can report immediately, because they behave, conditions where subjects are brain injured but conscious, so a little bit of a stress test for brain injury, but also conditions of disconnected consciousness, such as dreaming and ketamine hallucination. Subjects are unresponsive, like vegetative, but then they report a dream. This is to include the possibility that you can have disconnected consciousness. And on the other hand, the counterfactual is conditions where consciousness is decreased, such as non-REM sleep, anesthesia, and you see how the response changes, and then you can quantify this, and you come up with these distributions. And then you have this operational cutoff, and this is not the boundary between consciousness and unconsciousness, it's just really an operational cutoff. It says that if you are above the cutoff, if an unresponsive patient has levels of complexity that are similar to those of subjects that are dreaming, awake, hallucinating, conscious, you have to keep an eye on that patient, above and beyond behavioral unresponsiveness and other measures. So when we apply this to patients, this is what we see. So the first category of patients we study are minimally conscious patients. Those are patients that are somehow conscious. They show it in a fluctuating manner, difficult to detect sometimes. And when you perturb their brain and you measure complexity, most of them are above this operational cutoff, resulting in a high sensitivity, 94%. This is high sensitivity with respect to other measures. So roughly, fMRI active paradigm is around 10, and then the P3B evoked potential is around 14, depending on the method you use, can be 30, and the EEG is around 70% sensitivity. So it's good, and I think it is because you go below the surface of spontaneous activity, and you extract this deterministic core. And indeed, you can see high complexity even when the EEG is very bad. Slow waves and severely abnormal EEG, an EEG that you would score clinically as the EEG of somebody who's unconscious. And indeed, this is not surprising because we know that consciousness can be present among delta waves in many conditions. So going below the surface with the perturbation and using this radar can be useful and complementary to EEG. But then the real target, the real inference we make is in unresponsive patients because we don't know better here. And what we see here is that most of them are characterized by low complexity responses, sleep-like, anesthesia-like responses when we perturb intact islands of the brain. But then there is a share of patients that are high complexity. So, wakefulness, consciousness-like responses in spite of unresponsiveness, behaviorally speaking. And this is about 20%. So it's a significant number of patients. So what it means to be high complexity and unresponsive, I have many cases, but for the sake of time, I will show one case that we are about to publish. So this is a patient with a frontal lesion, pretty massive lesion due to aneurysm, and the common recovery scale is compatible with the vegetative state. The EEG is really bad, severely abnormal, slow waves, no gradients, and so everything would fit with a vegetative state diagnosis. But we know that these approaches, they have low sensitivity. So we go one step beyond, and we perform TMS-EEG, we measure complexity. Complexity is high. And then what it means? I mean, is it just a brain signal? Is it the patient is actually, somehow there? So in this case, we had the luxury of putting the patient in a scanner to run an active paradigm. So a paradigm whereby you ask the patient in the scanner to imagine to move his, for example, squeeze his right hand. And it's a luxury. You cannot do this with many patients, but this is for a confirmation. It's more conceptual, and the patient was able to do so. So he was able to understand the command. He produced this willful neuronal activation. So this is actual presence of some level of consciousness, not just a complexity measure. So it is relevant. And in other patients, the typical pattern, now that we've started, observing patients in the acute phase, subacute phase, upon discharge from the intensive care, is that they show high complexity while unresponsive, and then in the space of few weeks, they also show behavioral recovery, behavioral complexity after brain complexity. So it's an interesting measure, and this is now deployed in MGH in Boston with Brian Edlow, and this is an opinion paper that he wrote to, push the idea that maybe, although challenging, this is an opportunity to put this technique in the intensive care unit to complement other measures. This as far as measure goes, and but also we need to understand mechanism of loss and recovery of consciousness. And some patients, they recover spontaneously. First, brain complexity for some reason, so they move from this situation to this situation, and then they recover behavior. Others remain stuck. So the brain is partially intact, metabolically active, but stuck in this sleep-like, anesthesia-like, slow wave response, low complexity response. So this is why we made efforts all together to understand better what are the, the underpinning neuronal mechanisms of complexity. So first, we replicated this sort of measurement across many, many scales. This would take a long time to describe all these, really interesting experiments. But the bottom line is that we want to pin down some neuronal mechanism, and roughly, among many things, we have a common denominator to this situation of loss of complexity. That is the fact that whenever the response becomes simpler in sort of unconscious states or low complexity states, we have this pattern where neurons are becoming active at the beginning, and then they shut down. They go into a down state or silent period. This is called bistability, something we know very well that Mavi studied for a long time. And actually, what happens here is that you have the activation, a down state. This down state is breaking up causal interactions, and then complexity cannot grow. So it seems that we have an interesting mechanism there. And indeed, in sleep, we know that this can happen. In sleep, this happens typically because activating systems are going down, and you have more adaptation, and adaptation is producing these down states or increased inhibition. But the interesting thing is that we clearly see this in vegetative state patients. So neurons are becoming active, then they go down, complexity and causality is broken. And why is this happening after brain injury? There are many reasons, many ways. Long story short, you can increase adaptation because you have lesion in the brainstem, lesion in ascending fibers from the brainstem, diffuse axonal injury, more adaptation, down states, low complexity. You can have loss of excitation and thus increased inhibition. My slides, please. Thank you. Thank you, okay. Because you have lesions of lateral fibers. It can happen. But also, you can have more sleep-like dynamics if you have inflammation and also hypoxia. Everything can happen after brain injury, acute and chronic. So this is interesting. And it's interesting because sometimes patients, they get out of this state. They reduce by stability, they recover complexity, and they recover consciousness. So it's interesting to study this, also because this happens after stroke. So there is a possibility that this perilesional, sleep-like dynamics breaks up network and leads to further impairment after a lesion on top of the structural lesion. So it's all to be understood, and it's very interesting. I have 1 minute for 3 questions that I would like to ask. And the first question is, having said all this, we see patients recovery, we see patients getting rid of this sleep-like bistability, this intrusion of sleep dynamics into wakefulness, because vegetative patients are awake, eyes open. And the question is, can we do something to push and to favor this process? So far, Mavi showed that you can do something in a slice by pharmacological modulation. But there are also ways, and Mavi is studying this, and to modulate activity with electric fields. We can do this in humans with TMS, TDCS. There are so many opportunities to try to understand and revert this process. And I think modeling will play a major role in helping us together with this multiscale understanding. So this is one question for the future. Can we do something about it? The other question is, yes, we pin down this mechanism, but within HBP, there's another interesting mechanism. So Matthew Larkham discovered this dendritic decoupling. So far, we were not able, we didn't even try to connect these two mechanisms. They're not mutually exclusive, but how do they interact by stability, dendritic decoupling? Are they linked? And is dendritic decoupling playing a role after brain injury? I don't know. I would like to explore this if possible in the future. And then for the ethical team within HBP, we develop measures that are brain-based, and then sometimes we show that these measures are high, suggesting the presence of consciousness. Sometimes we can confer with behavior because they recover, because we put them in a scanner. Sometimes we can't. So what is this? Is this a brain signal, or is this the fact that the patient is conscious, but we cannot just access this consciousness? What kind of consciousness is this, and what are the implications? Thank you very much to everybody in Milan, but especially all the colleagues and friends here, and I hope the journey can go on even after the project is done. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here in the last summit of HBP, so it's kind of a bittersweet time. So I was not really implicated directly in any work packages, but my work has been heavily influenced by it, so it's a great honor to acknowledge HBP in my work. Plus, I've been serving as an ethics rapporteur for some time, so I feel that I'm connected to the community, and I'm very glad that I'm here. And yeah, it's a kind of a closure, but any closure is a great chance for a new opening. So why not consciousness, right? And today I would like to show you my take on human consciousness and how I developed it with my work and how I think it will be going in the next years. So let's define consciousness, what I mean by consciousness. I guess everybody can have their own definition, and if only we were able to reduce it to one word, right? That would be fantastic. But it seems like more and more the realization that it's kind of a constellation of notions and mechanisms that they need to be jointly together in order to define different states. And today I would like to show you how we can identify some of these dimensions by means of resting state fMRI, which is the the modality I've been using the last years. So limits of reportability, here I mean mostly in terms of on the bedside, on the clinical dimension, as Marcello showed before, but also how this work gave a chance to identify contentless experiences even during typical conditions, and I will show you what I mean later on. So why the resting condition? Well, first of all, it's very, very easy. It's really a great means to put somebody in an fMRI scanner, 10 minutes recordings, and try to make sense of what's happening in their brain. Very convenient means of recording. And also, we know that the resting condition, at least in the ongoing experience, is very rich. So we know that even when we do nothing, we are experiencing a very rich stream of thought, stream of consciousness that actually is kind of very informative. As we know that, considering that the brain is only 2% of the body's weight and evoked changes that are accounted by less than 5%, which means that 80% of neuronal signaling is dedicated to support these resting conditions. And Marcus Reichel was identifying that very well, like while consciousness awareness is energetically inexpensive, like we know that, it is dependent upon a very complex, dynamically organized state of the brain that is achieved at great expense. So let's try to decipher what this resting state does and how it can help us get information about conscious states. So the first work we did had to do with systems anti-correlations. So I guess you are all familiar with the default mode network, right? That regions of the brain that encompass mainly midline, posterior cingulate, precuneus, and mesiofrontal cortices. But what is interesting is that these regions anticorrelate with other brain areas, especially the frontoparietal area domain. And what we notice is that there is a great information if we take the anticorrelations into account. So we know, for example, here we can see how the default mode network anticorrelations, they look like in wakefulness, but under propofol anesthesia, there is a dramatic reduction of the anticorrelations. Plus, we see that although DMN across different patient groups, they keep existing, moving from healthy people to patients that emerge from minimally conscious state, and unresponsive. And the correlations actually characterize only healthy situations. Healthy people, patients that they are conscious, but in clinical conditions, they go even on the other state, or the other direction. And lately, we know that the correlations are very sensitive to extreme environments, and this is a very funky collaboration, I'm telling you, with the European Space Agency, that they give us the chance to analyze the data of astronauts, cosmonauts, but also analogs like parabolic flight. So when we checked the parabolic flight effects on the human brain, and full disclosure, I participated, it was a very profound experience. If you have to do it, please do. So experience to microgravity and gravity alterations really led to reduction of the anticorrelations. So why anticorrelations then? What does it mean, right? So we recently theorized that they are accounted by the notion of neural inhibition. So this biological mechanism that inhibits the one area from the other. And it's not to say directly that one neuron has to inhibit the other in order for the anticorrelations to appear. It can also happen indirectly, like, for example, by having an excitatory influence one region to the other. This excitatory influence helps a cascade of local feedback inhibition to begin. So this regional heterogeneity, we think that is indirectly responsible for the emergence of the anticorrelations. And we know that from computational works that when they took back these feedback loops, how metastable dynamics were abolished. So this heterogeneity, we think that is responsible for the notion of ignition. The work of Gustavo here is very influential on that. So ignition means that the work of activity of one region to the other is propagated in a meaningful way. And it is a notion that is actually supported by several theories of consciousness. So long story short, when you have anticorrelations, most probably it's a good thing. Let's keep them. Another area of work that we've been doing during resting state has to do with brain dynamics. So we know that if we take the functional connectome and we see how it evolves in time, this can have a rich configuration of different regions, brain patterns. And we know that brain dynamics are very important to support performance, emotion, cognition. And when they get very stuck in one pattern, let's say, so the dynamics are less metastable, they become very rigid, the spatio-temporal organization, and we can see that in sleep, but also in anesthesia in humans and animals, which has been theorized that if this happens, the brain cannot map the complexity of the internal and external world. So we sought out to quantify how these different configurations look like in patient groups, as Marcello pointed out before. And we had the great chance to put together different data sets from Liège, Paris, Canada, London, Ontario, and Cornell. Well, we put together different data sets. We see, and we analyzed how the patterns would appear across time. So we found that there were essentially 4 different types of configurations, like a very complex pattern characterized by long range, short range connectivity, correlated, uncorrelated, in stark contrast of pattern 4 were regions that don't talk to one another, and this was mostly appearing in patient groups in unresponsive state, whereas this complex would appear in healthy controls, and 2 other patterns that they were not preferentially in any patient group. So we thought that maybe they were like transitional states. The real dynamics, though, they were, we had, that was a great work, because another sanity check we did is like how these patterns would look like if we put people under propofol anesthesia. And now these complex patterns were actually reduced, and the simple pattern 4 was most prominent in across all patient groups now. So there seems to be something important and informative when it comes to the spatio-temporal complexity of brain organization. The real dynamics, though, were checked when we saw the transitions among patterns, and we found that the higher your level of consciousness, like moving from healthy people to minimally conscious and unresponsive state, so we see here in black, you have more chances to entertain the complex pattern and leave it to explore all other patterns. But if you're in a lower state of consciousness, moving from unresponsive state, you have more chances to entertain complex, simple configurations and leave them only for other simpler ones. So that means that metastable dynamics, they're very important to consciousness, and that was a very critical point, at least in my history of research, because this led to the idea arose by a famous reviewer too. We all know them, right? That they are actually pointing stuff that you would never thought before, and actually it was very, very helpful, because during the review we had the observation of this especially simple configuration that would appear also in healthy people. So the question we received is what does it mean? Would that mean people from time to time would not have the chance to entertain any thought? And at that time, we theorized in the paper, oh yeah, maybe that is the neurocorrelate of mind blanking, like the condition of when somebody asks you, like, what are you thinking now? You say, nothing in particular, right? Later on, though, we said, okay, we have the chance to check it. Why don't we go for it and quantify it? So we were grateful to colleagues from University of Liège who did experience sampling in the fMRI some years ago, checking different contents of thought, such as direct perceptions of the environment, stimulus-dependent thoughts or stimulus-independent thoughts. And by that time in the paradigm, they also included the category of absences, but they did not analyze it. So we were really at we had a great opportunity to see what is the brain configuration when people were saying, I have no thought. So first we replicated that mind blanking was happening very rarely compared to content-oriented reports. That goes with the literature. It happens with probabilities, equal probabilities at the beginning until the end of the acquisition session. And that was quite interesting because we did not have any task. It was purely like experience sampling. We did not probe people to do any tasks. So this was interesting to find that we have equal probabilities to show mind blanks. And the chances to report mind blanking were also very, very low. And if people were reporting a contentless thought, they would leave it for more contentful reports. We managed to open the data. That was not evident, but we did. And actually, I'm really looking forward to the HBP's Health Data Cloud, which seems to be really addressing GDPR issues and also security issues. And I really hope that will be going operational very soon because I would really, really use it. So when it comes to mind blanking, contrary to what we hypothesized in the previous study, we have even had an internal bet with my PhD trainee because I was betting that mind blanking would be mostly linked to this pattern 4, very simple pattern, but data showed that actually this pattern 3 was most closely to the configurations being around mind blanking reports. And that was, first of all, disappointed because I lost the bet, but also it gives great insights to see what does this mean. Like all brain regions talk to one another in a very synchronized way, at least with fMRI, and what would that mean? When we check the literature, it means that we found that this hyperconnectivity between brain regions doesn't mean hyperactivity. It's a correlation matrix. It means that regions, they are correlating the same way. And if we go to the literature, we see that similar configurations appear in non-REM sleep, where all regions, they are talk to one another the same way, but also in anesthesia in animals like isoflurane, where we can see also that all regions will show correlated activity. We also know from a very important study using EEG that this slow wave hypothesis happening even during wakefulness is a thing. Like our colleague Thomas Drillon showed that this slow wave activity that is primarily seen in sleep can also appear during wakefulness. And when they checked their data, where they used actually a task, a very, very heavy task, people reporting mind blanking had primarily more significant activity in electrodes, especially at the posterior part of the brain, and that was predictive of mental states. So this kind of unconscious reports were correlated with the slow wave activity at the posterior electrodes. So in our data set, how could we account for this arousal component? So in fMRI, we know that we did not have an EEG correlate, but we had the chance to use the global signal. The fMRI global signal is the average activity across all voxels of the brain, and that usually we accounted for during pre-processing. We take it out in order to correct the signal. But if we take the amplitude of the global signal, it seems that it's quite informative of the brain's arousal state, because, and we found that the amplitude of the global signal for mind-blanking reports was higher than other states. What does the amplitude of the global signal account for? Well, the literature says that it reflects the level of arousal, as it's positively correlated with delta activity. So the higher the global signal, the lower the arousal, and negatively correlated with alpha. And here we can see that caffeine intake can really change the amplitude. So here we can see like the vigilance goes higher, and after the caffeine session here, there was a higher importance in the alpha band. So it carries some information about the arousal. And it was shown also that is linked to signal decreases also in subcortical structures of arousal. We wanted to check how these would look like in healthy conditions when it comes to aging. So we recruited healthy aged seniors over 65 years old, and we checked as a proxy of arousal pupil size. So within experience sampling with mind blanking, mind wandering, and sensations, we found that seniors were showing less arousal levels than young people. And when they were reporting mind blanking, these seemed to be stemming from a hyperarousal state, the opposite. And that was translated as less focus for them. So we start to understand that maybe mind blanking does not only happen due to a low arousal, but maybe a higher arousal. And now we are checking it out. We have this hypothesis that mental state reportability might have an embodied component. So this is a registry report. We're collecting data now where we do experience sampling as a baseline measure, during baseline, where we also monitor pupil size, heart rate, and electrodermal activity, but also EEG. And then we expose people to high, intense physical training, accounting for high arousal or sleep deprivation. And then we do experience sampling afterwards. So the idea is, like, in both cases, mind blanking reports would be higher. In my perspective, I think all this comes very nicely together under the principle of active inference. This means that whenever we have we're using our priors in order to predict what's happening, especially when things go wrong. And this depends on the brain's predictive ability, and which is in constant dialogue with physiological states, that there starts a cascade of top-down expectations by having information from a sensory ascending sensory input with the aim to minimize prediction errors. And this comes very nicely in cases, as I said, when things go wrong, like external perturbations. This idea we're checking now, actually we just concluded the data. It was a very intense protocol in collaboration with the ENT department and the anesthesiology department, where we aim to perturb an interoceptive system like the balance system. Cardiac system would be very dangerous, so we wanted to find a way to perturb something that changes the interoperceptions, and vestibular functioning can be such one. So we did a caloric irrigation protocol. You have warm water in your ear, and then you experience with that quite a vertigo. And physiologically, you can show this nystagmus activity. It's very, very interesting sensation. If you have not done it, do it. It's like being heavily drunk for 20 seconds and then again and again and again. So the idea is, like, all these trials, maybe we find that they have an effect on how reflexes adapt. And stay tuned if you're interested. Hope by next year we'll have published the results. But the idea that we can evidence sentience by probing interoceptive functions. So coming full circle, I hope I show you some dimensions of consciousness that can be useful, also at the clinical, at the bedside. So the idea for me now is like the bed is like trying to identify these dimensions and features that they are jointly sufficient in order to account for different states of consciousness. And with this, I would like to thank you again for the invitation, and I'm very open to questions when they come.
So, good morning, everybody. Mavi just told me that I have 10 minutes to say a presentation of 20 minutes, so I will try my best. So I will go fast. I am Pablo. I'm a computer scientist. I work in robotics. I just became a father. I'm very sleep deprived, and I think I'm conscious. I'm looking for Marcello to actually make a device to measure my complexity right now, if I'm conscious or not. Anyway, today I want to talk about my scientific hobby. I don't want to move here. So that is about robots that are conscious. But I will specifically talk about body perception and awareness. I didn't want to talk about ChatGPT, but I will say it. No, any big, large language models are sentient. They are not conscious. Not AI is conscious. Not robotics are conscious. Okay, and this is about what is about the talk. And the first reason of why robots are not conscious is the first thing is like we don't understand fully. We fully don't understand how it works. Right, that is the question that was in the beginning when I started in this research is like, where is my consciousness? No, there is so many theories, there is so many approaches that we don't know where to start and what to implement. In the end, we have to implement it in the robot. The second reason is that, of course, consciousness is not exclusive to humans or even to primates. So maybe we have different spectrum of consciousness, and this is difficult to model. And I actually put it here, this controversial experiment with the fish that recognized in a mirror. And I will go back later to that. The third reason is that actually conscious robots raise ethical concerns. And also Dahin was pointing out in the 2017 Science that it is doubtful that we will achieve it in the lifetime, right? So why we will go and put investment here if it is ethical, has ethical concerns. But the most important one, I think, for robotics, I'm coming from robotics, and we know that this is the most important one, is like, if there is no utility in consciousness, why we are going to invest money and resources on investigating this in robotics? We can build cars without being conscious. Why we need it? Okay, but yes, but. No, and I'm kind of an utopic researcher somehow. And when I read the theories about consciousness, people are talking about monitoring, evaluation, abstraction, second-order decision-making. And for me, actually, those aspects are very important to improve adaptation, to improve predictability, to improve accountability of the action generated in the world. And this is very important if you want a robot interacting with you in your house, right? So in the end, for me, consciousness is just a pathway, right? But we have a lot of things we have to investigate before that, like multisensory integrator, self-monitoring, until we go to what I'm interested in the most, that is related to the body, and the action is body ownership, some local states of consciousness. So my approach, and I'm sorry, Marcello, that I'm going back to the functional side, to the function, is a very functional approach to consciousness, specifically to body awareness. And I will want to talk about Chalmers. We were talking about the hard problem. I really want to solve first the easy problem and then go to the hard problem somehow. Okay. So for trying to pull this to body awareness into a robot, we have to first understand what we can do being unconscious and being unaware, right? And we know that we can do many things not being unconscious, sorry. So, and for that, I will take this approach of predictive coding. I put this brain here always to remind me how far we are to actually doing the real deal. But I want to, if you don't know what is predictive coding, I hope that you know it, but the simple idea is that you have some visual input in the V1, and then you have from other cortical layers some expectations. When they compare these two signals, there's a prediction error that is propagated, that changes the state of the brain. Okay, so thanks to Dr. Friston, we have a way to model these into differential equations. And the good thing of using differential equations is that we can really deploy them into robotics. But in the end, this is a dynamical system that is trying to minimize the prediction error. So for me, it will be body perception, and conscious will be this type of thing. And I will use an example to tell you how this works. And I will use the classical paradigm of the rubber hand illusion proposed by Botvinnik. The rubber hand illusion is very easy. You just put a rubber hand in front of it, then you cover your hand, and then you stimulate, like you see in the video. And what we know is actually when you ask the participants, where was the hand, there is a estimation, a drift of estimation of your hand towards the rubber hand. So this is easy to model. We can just put the dynamical equation of sensory-motor integration, and just we check how estimation changes. And then we have that. Then we can actually replicate the rubber hand illusion, proprioceptive drift, into a robot. And you can see here an example of my student stimulating the robot, and we can see on the top right that the estimation, that's the blue circle, is shifting towards the supposedly rubber hand of the robot. Okay. But what about action? What about motor control? If it is running? Yes. So when I was working with Antonella Maselli and also Giovanni Pezzulo, they were telling me that when they use VR, they try to fit their body to the visual input, right? So what happened? There is also an unconscious action there. So our hypothesis is that there is not only a change on perception, but it's also an action that is happening, so it's there. There is an action that is trying also to minimize this prediction error. And you can see the equation there, the equation that models how prediction error will induce an action. So we did an experiment, very easy experiment with virtual reality, where you put 3 conditions. The virtual hand is on the left, in the same position of your hand, or in the right position. And then we measured the forces. And interestingly, we were seeing that all actions, all forces that we recorded were towards the virtual hand. So this means that we have perception unconscious that we can model, we have action unconscious that we can model, and we put this, and we put in a blender, we put it into the robot, we can have this kind of behavior. This is the ICAP robot with a predictive coding model, and we can see that we can get this type of toddler reaching component without being conscious, right? So we can have even complex movements without being aware of our body. Good. So we can have body perception and action without being conscious. This is clear. So let's try to go to awareness. But before I jumped into awareness, I want to mention one thing, that is the mirrored self-recognition. This has been proposed by Gallup Jr. in 1970, and it was supposed to be the test for self-awareness. If you don't know what it is, it's just you have a chimpanzee, you put a mirror in the place that the chimpanzee is, then you sleep the chimpanzee, you put a mark on the face of the chimpanzee, and then when you put back the chimpanzee in front of the mirror, what you expect is an action, a behavior, where the monkey actually try to grab this mark. Okay, this is an oversimplification, but this is exactly what happens on the mirror self-recognition. So I say, okay, can we model this in a robot? And we did it. We did self-order distinction in the robot that you can see on the left. And we did also, with the visual appearance cue, we tried to pass the mirror self-recognition. The takeoff here is that we can pass the mirror self-recognition test without being conscious. So then, why we need awareness in robotics? And I will motivate that for ending my talk here, talking about awareness in the body, thanks to two students that are very intelligent or conscious somehow. And I will motivate this with a project that recently started that is called MetaTool. And the idea here is like 3.3 million years ago, we were using tools. And suddenly, well, not suddenly, 1 million years afterwards, there was something changed. That we started to construct the tools, we started to invent these tools. Our hypothesis is that it's not pure exploratory change. So we have something that is doing to help us to perform tool invention. And for us, this will be awareness in the sense of you can monitor your body so you can realize that you can perform a task or not perform a task with confidence. I took confidence from a keyword from metacognition, from Steve Fleming. And this monitoring system, I'm not saying where it's coming from, but the idea is that there is a monitoring system that is helping us to make this cognitive leap. Okay. So now I will go a little bit mathy. So maybe I will lose some part of the audience, but I will try to keep it simple. So I told you that we can do a state estimation action with prediction error minimization, right? So how we can go to measure the confidence that we have about the actions that we do, this type of monitoring. So in principle, we can do this mathematically with what we call the precision parameters or the inverse variance, but it's pretty similar from the neuroscience community to talk about neural gain control. In the end, if you have a gain that if it decreases, you change the postsynaptic response depending on the input. For my own terms will be, for instance, low precision actually influence in how the sensory input influence on the state estimation, okay? So, what we were proposing is that if you can track, at the same time that you can track the state of the neurons, state of the brain, if you can track these precision parameters online, then you can have this type of monitoring system. In here, I will go back to this equation, but this is the critical point. And in previous works, this precision was or fixed or was computed through data after multiple repetitions of the action. So the idea is how we can track these variables. So I will again motivate with the rubber hand illusion, and I want to tell you how the brain might realize that it has to change the model of reality. So imagine that we have two models in the rubber hand illusion. Model 1, my hand is the real one, my hand, and the model 2 is actually my hand is the rubber hand, right? And depending on that model, we have different observations. What happens when the hand is covered? When the hand is covered, we have an increase on the noise of the environment, okay, according to our model. And if we can track that, so we can measure the noise of the environment, that is, we call it noise precision, we will affect the precision of our estimates of the model. Okay, so we have the model, we have the noise precision, and we have the precision of the estimates. With these three things, if we can put a criteria where we have a model that is, model 1 is my own hand, model 2 is the rubber hand, and we have a criteria that depends on two precision parameters, we can do what you can see on the right. When your hand is visible, the model that has less uncertainty is actually your own hand, right? But when you cover the hand, suddenly these precision parameters that we are tracking change totally the uncertainty of your models. And what happens is there is a perceptual switch. And suddenly, the model that actually fits is the less uncertain will be that the rubber hand is the rubber hand. So in this case, we are modeling the body ownership. So I want to finalize with a proposition. An agent that can learn or adapt online the environmental noise precision, so actually the difference between what you actually model as your model and the real environmental noise. If you can also monitor the precisions over your estimates, and if you can use these two things to plan or change your whole model, then my statement will be that this agent is aware. Of course, at least it will be a synthetic awareness, maybe not the human awareness. So I would like to thank you very much, and also I'm not here only because of consciousness. We are doing many works on the Human Brain Project related to object-based perception and action and spiking neural network control. So we have posters. You are welcome to also go to the poster session. Thank you very much.
Okay, so thank you very much for the speakers. I have enjoyed very much their talks covering different aspects of consciousness, and I hope you have also enjoyed them. I think we have done good timing as well. There is no time for questions or discussion, but you will have the speakers around. You can talk to them if you want. So thank you very much to the speakers again and to all of you for your attention. Thanks.